In the Beijing circle, the heir Les is famous for his disinterest in women, yet he keeps a delicate and soft canary like me. Everyone in the circle speculates how long it will take before he gets bored, but in the end, it was I who initiated the breakup and left without looking back. Once, after drinking too much, Les asked a friend in confusion, "Have I not been good enough to her? Haven't I given her enough?" 5 years later, when we met again, my daughter and I were cornered by some bizarre relatives. Les was still high up, accompanied by luxury cars and beautiful women. I held back my tears, taking my daughter and leaving, but he coldly called out to me, "Nina, call me husband, and I'll back you up." In the first year of being with Les, many people in the circle quietly placed bets on how long he would stay interested in me. After all, the heir who never comes down from his high pedestal only had the words, "Women, please stay away," written on his face. Some guessed I had used witchcraft on Les. Others said my seductive eyes and pointed chin might bewitch him. Fearing I had a fox spirit, some even asked me directly, "Nina, how did you manage to attract Les?" My friend took off all her clothes, and Les didn't even look at her. She almost cried her heart out. Then they glanced at my chest. "Where did you get this chest done? Can you give me the name card of the expert?" I set my coffee down and smiled. I didn't seduce him. He pursued me. Les doesn't like proactive women, so tell your friend not to be too upset. As for the chest, if you're not satisfied, maybe ask Nuwa to remold you. After that, I didn't look at their expressions, and got up and walked away. I usually don't respond like this, but I was in a bad mood that day. I just couldn't hold back. The girl cried loudly and went to complain to Les, her distant cousin. Les, upon hearing this, laughed. "She's not wrong, cousin," the girl cried, stamping her feet. "All right, if you keep crying, Nuwa might have to remold your face too." Les said this and then, with a bit of annoyance, added, "Don't provoke her in the future." If she got annoyed, it was still him who had to go back and comfort her. If he failed, he had to stay in the guest room. In reality, Les wasn't good at comforting people. He only had a few tricks up his sleeve. Either he showered people with expensive gifts, or he wore them out in bed until they had no energy left to argue. But that night when he came home, I didn't let him comfort me. Even as he came out of the bathroom, I actively clung to him, wearing a black silk camisole with lace on the chest and the slit. Just lifting my leg slightly revealed a glimpse of spring. Les firmly supported my body, his breathing a bit uneven. "Nina." "Les. I'm about to start my period." I tilted my face up for a kiss. He lowered his head to kiss me, his hot palms holding my buttocks as he carried me to the bed. "So you're in a bad mood." Les placed me on the bed, his arms propped on either side of my body. "No." I shook my head. I lifted my leg to rub against his firm thigh beneath the bathrobe. "I just really want it." Les was stunned for a moment, then began kissing me passionately like a storm. Spring arrived in Beijing. It felt as if everything was brimming with restless energy. On a warm spring night, it started raining again. The world outside the window was cold and damp, but inside, it was hot and humid with spring fever. I lay on the bed, my fingers limply falling by my side. Les kissed my shoulder tenderly while reaching into the drawer for a condom, but I pressed his arm down. "We're in the safe period. I don't want to use it." Perhaps it was because I was particularly proactive tonight. Les was more intense than usual. Unlike his usual gentle self, he was rough, as if he forgot I was usually weak and delicate. Until later, I couldn't endure it anymore, tears welling up in my eyes as I looked at him pitifully. Les finally slowed down, kissing me gently. "Nina, how should I ask you?" I closed my eyes, letting him kiss me, and after a while, I whispered, "Husband." This is the 3rd year of being with Les. No one in the circle is betting on when he will get bored anymore, but no one expected that a sister Les had secretly admired in his youth suddenly returned to the country after a divorce. Les' cousin was the first to find me. "Nina, you won't be proud for long. Maggie is back." My cousin personally went to pick her up at the airport in the middle of the night. Her divorce settlement was also one with a huge sum, spent by my cousin hiring top international lawyers. The girl looked at me triumphantly. "No matter how beautiful you are, it's useless. My future cousin-in-law will only be a refined lady like Maggie. Just wait to be kicked out." I sat there in a daze, not knowing how long I sat. I called Les several times, but he didn't answer. Later, when I called again, his phone was simply turned off. That night, I waited until late into the night, but Les did not come home. I touched my flat abdomen, feeling a mess inside. I wanted to tell him I was pregnant, but the person Les loved had returned at this time. How he would choose seemed to be already clear. Les' cousin sent me several photos. I received the photos just as I came out of the hospital. The spring sun was warm around me. I looked at the pictures of a graceful and beautiful young woman. At first, my mind was blank, but gradually, more and more confusing information flooded in. The final image slowly crystallized. It was my cold, stiff body under a bridge in heavy snow. And in the end, my daughter. She was not yet 5 years old but was heartlessly sent to an orphanage by Les. He looked at me with eyes as cold as frost, and his words were even more chilling. Nina, this is all your own doing. I gave you money, and we are settled, but you chose to hurt Maggie. You deserve this outcome. And as for the child I fathered, Maggie doesn't like her, so I won't recognize her. My tears suddenly streamed down uncontrollably. It turned out I was just a cannon fodder in a wealthy pursuit novel. Even this child was just a tool I had maliciously schemed. But even with the daughter born, Les still didn't want us. He would ultimately end up with his destined leading lady. Les didn't come home for 3 days. I also seriously thought for 3 days. In the end, I decided that as a canary, I should have the awareness of a canary. Now that the main character had returned, I left willingly, making way for the main character. So, my and my daughter's fate would also completely change? These days, Les' mind was completely on that sister. He didn't come home and didn't even make a phone call. I called him as usual, and he answered, his tone as gentle as ever. I've been busy these days. If you're bored, go out with friends. Remember to take your health supplements on time. Behave and wait for me at home. I obediently agreed, but I didn't go out or take the medicine, instead secretly disposing of it. My health was severely weak, and it was hard to get pregnant. If I didn't keep this child, I might never be able to have another. Besides, I wanted to give birth to her. I wanted to love her properly, and make up for her. Without Les' return, I had a lot of time to pack up. I took a portion of the jewelry and accessories each day. In the end, I left with just a bag. On the taxi to the airport, I saw a friend's post. Sister-brother relationships are forever the best. In the group photo, Les and Maggie were separated by 2 people, but Maggie's gaze was tenderly smiling at him. My heart ached sharply. The taxi sped forward, my tear ducts uncontrollably swelling. Everything in front of me turned into a blur. When Les received the call from the servant, his expression suddenly changed. He said nothing, grabbed his coat, and walked straight out. Les, is something wrong? Maggie instinctively followed. There's something at home. I need to go back immediately. You don't look well. Let me go with you. Before Maggie could finish, he interrupted directly, no need, Les. Maggie was somewhat aggrieved. Les, however, didn't look back, quickly stepping into the elevator. At that moment, the entire villa was in disarray. The servants hadn't noticed anything unusual in the past few days. It wasn't until 9 p.m., when I still hadn't returned, that they started to panic. Les got out of the car, his face dark as he looked at everyone. When did she leave? This afternoon at 3. Miss said she was going out for tea and shopping with friends. He seemed furious, his lips pressed tightly together, and he quickly went upstairs. The bedroom was empty, the safe was open, and the valuable jewelry had all disappeared. Only some rings and necklaces were scattered carelessly. It looked like they had been rejected. Les' face grew increasingly dark. The servants stood with their heads bowed, not daring to make a sound. After a while, he suddenly waved his hand to dismiss them, until the entire main building was left with only him. He sat on the sofa, staring at the empty room. Suddenly, he laughed at himself. I didn't expect Les to call me. With his background, he was inherently proud. He would never force a woman. After all, many people wanted to be involved with him. The name, Les, on the screen was somewhat glaring. I clutched my phone, and in the end, when the ringtone stopped, I didn't answer. Les called again. This time, I answered. Les, I spoke casually. Nina, where are you? I've already left Beijing. Les, we've settled everything. For these 3 years, I met your needs, and you gave me money and jewelry. We owe each other nothing. Nothing owed. Yes, so don't look for me anymore. On the other end of the phone, there was a long silence. Just as I was about to hang up, Les' voice finally came through heavily. All right, I hung up, staring blankly out the window, the tears I had been holding in finally falling. 5 years later, when I saw Les again, it was at my worst and most desperate moment. After my parents died a year ago, relatives began fighting over the inheritance and house they left me. I was running between courts and law offices with my daughter every day. I was almost at my wit's end. My daughter was sick and uncomfortable today, constantly listless. I held her and left the lawyer's office, just outside the building, unable to hold back my tears any longer. Seeing me cry, my daughter also pouted and cried. My parents used to joke about me, saying that the big Cribbaby gave birth to a little Cribbaby, but back then, they were there to support me. Crying was just a way of showing affection. Now, with no one to rely on, who was there to see my tears? I wanted to hold back my tears but couldn't. In the end, holding my daughter, we squatted by the roadside, crying in each other's arms. And just so happened, Les' car happened to stop beside us. When I heard the car and tried to move away with my daughter, I saw him immediately. He stepped out of the car in a suit, accompanied by a secretary and assistant. The last to exit was an exceptionally beautiful young woman, and Les must have seen me too. His gaze swept over my face. It didn't linger for a moment. After 5 years, he seemed 100 times colder and harder to approach than before. Les, wait a bit. Didn't you wait for me? The beautiful woman smiled sweetly, playfully scolding him. Les stopped his steps, seemingly waiting for her. I held back my tears, willingly taking my still sniffling daughter and walking away. But as I turned, tears started rolling down uncontrollably. I also noticed, the woman beside Les wasn't the sister he once liked. She must be his new girlfriend, fiancée, or wife. But all this no longer had anything to do with me. Nina, but Les suddenly called out to me. His voice was cold, devoid of warmth. My steps froze suddenly, but I didn't turn around. Behind me, familiar footsteps gradually approached. My heart raced uncontrollably, beating fast, until his footsteps stopped, and it felt like the warm breeze had suddenly ceased. My back was damp with sweat, and my whole body was trembling. My daughter nestled in my arms, her small body hot. She groaned uncomfortably, looking at me with tear-filled eyes. At this moment, my heart was in boiling torment. Gradually, even the sadness turned numb. No matter how hard I tried, it seemed impossible to change the tragic fate of me and my daughter. Time's current pulled me back into Les' world, pushing my fate back to the starting point. I felt a deep sense of helplessness, but my daughter was only 4. I couldn't bear to think of what might happen to her if she were sent to the orphanage. Would she be bullied? Would she suffer? Mommy, Arlene is uncomfortable. My daughter's little hand clutched my neck. She lay in my arms, groaning in discomfort. My emotions suddenly broke down. Turning around, I looked at Les with reddened, swollen eyes, but like a lump in my throat, I couldn't utter a word. His expression was too indifferent, just like when he and Maggie stood in front of me at the end of the story. My heart tightened little by little. The feelings of grievance and sadness were gradually swallowed by immense fear. In the 3 years together, I rarely saw him like this. The only time, it seemed, was when I ran into an old school senior. We had dinner, coffee, and chatted. Since talking about school days was enjoyable, I lost track of time. When I got home, it was a bit late. For the first time, Les had a cold face toward me. I felt somewhat guilty. He usually pampered and comforted me more. That seemed to be the first time I comforted him, but Les was evidently hard to comfort. Whatever I said, he remained indifferent. Finally, I made fruit tea and brought it to his study. He rare to be somewhat sarcastic. Fruit tea doesn't have the aroma of coffee. I thought of going to the cafe with the senior. I felt inexplicably guilty. So, I tried to comfort him more carefully. How about I make you coffee? No, Les. What do I need to do to make you not angry? He lazily leaned on the sofa, removing his glasses and placing them aside. Nina, you know what you need to do. I bit my lip and slowly moved closer, straddling his lap and wrapping my arms around his neck. I softly called out, husband. That night, he was rather demanding, until I truly couldn't endure it. Les finally let me go. If I find out you're chatting so happily with another man, Nina, even 100 husbands won't spare you. Nina, Les called my name again, pulling my thoughts away from the memories. Yes, Les has always been a man of his word. So, in the scenes I remember, he ended up with Maggie. No matter how much I cried and begged him, calling him my husband, he never showed any sign of softening. In the end, he watched me die in misery with no tears shed. So why should I still harbor any illusions? Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that maybe it was just my imagination. The man who had been so indifferent moments ago now seemed to have his ice-cold demeanor melting away. His once stern face began to show a gentle warmth I used to be so familiar with. I couldn't help but bite my lip and lower my gaze. His look was only making me feel worse. I once thought he had feelings for me, but later I realized, it was just his chivalry, his manners. Les took a step closer. I instinctively stepped back. Nina, on this scorching afternoon, everything was silent. Only the sweltering heat seemed to be consuming everything. Les, dressed in a business suit, looked as if he was barely managing to endure the heat. He closed his eyes and sighed lightly. When he looked at me again, his eyes showed only a hint of helpless resignation. Call me, husband, and I'll back you up. Les had imagined countless scenarios of reuniting with Nina. He thought he would be indifferent, treating her like a stranger, or perhaps he would darkly seek revenge. But when Nina actually appeared before him, he found that all his imagined scenarios had turned to vapor. She didn't need to say a word. Just the sight of her tearful eyes made his heart soften like melting ice. At that moment, all that filled his mind was one thought. Why is she crying so much? Who has hurt her? He couldn't bear to see her hurt. How much has she suffered over the years? After Nina took his money and left without looking back, Les thought he would forget this materialistic and heartless woman within days. But after one drunken night, he had said something to a friend. Was I not good enough to her? Not generous enough? Perhaps that was when Les began to realize. In this 3-year relationship, he might have been more invested than he thought. I was stunned. The people behind Les were equally shocked. The beautiful young woman first widened her eyes in surprise, then suddenly let out a scream like a fire alarm. Les, I thought you lived like a monk every day, pure and untouched, completely uninterested in women. She stomped over in high heels. Turns out it was all fake. You hypocrite. You even let someone call you husband. You're so indecent. Her voice grew louder and louder. Les' brows furrowed deeper and deeper. Clearly, the noise was annoying him more than the sound of cicadas. Is this child yours too? Les, you act so respectable, but behind the scenes, you got a young girl pregnant and abandoned her. Scum. The woman's righteous indignation only grew. I even feared she might slap Les in anger, but Les was indeed at fault. He said such strange things in front of her. No woman would tolerate it. I lowered my head, hoping not to be blamed, hoping the anger wouldn't be directed at me. I hadn't said a word throughout. Auntie, Les couldn't tolerate it any longer. If you want to scold me, can you wait until we get home? I was struck dumb. Auntie. She seemed too young for that. The woman was evidently pleased by my astonished look. She gave Les a slap on the back, saying, I told you to call me, sister, outside. And why are you calling me, auntie, at your age? Les seized the moment. You'll roast in the sun a little longer. All the cosmetic work you had done this year will be for nothing. I'll settle this when I get back, you scumbag. After she finished speaking, she smiled at me. Little girl, don't forgive this scum too easily, and don't call him husband. It'll just annoy him more. I was still in a daze, nodding foolishly. The woman was satisfied, gave Les one last glare, and left quickly. Les seemed somewhat embarrassed, and cleared his throat. It's too hot outside. Let's get in the car. After he said that, seeing I was standing still, he didn't look at me but instead glanced at Arlene. Take her to the hospital first. I can take a cab. Nina. I held my daughter close and turned to leave, but Les grabbed my wrist. Then he took my daughter from my arms. She looked at the stranger with a mix of fear and distress, on the verge of crying, but seeing Les' cold face, she seemed scared. I hurriedly reached out to take her back. She's scared of strangers, I said, trying to get my daughter back. Once we're in the car, I'll give her back to you. She has a fever and needs to go to the hospital immediately, Les said, looking at me with a serious expression. Seeing my daughter's flushed face, I was anxious too. The longer we delayed, the more my child would suffer. I got in the car, and Les kept his promise. Once my daughter was back in my arms, she clung to my neck tightly. I kissed her little face and felt comforted. It wasn't for nothing that I cared for her. She forgot me as soon as she saw her father. At the hospital, the doctor quickly started an IV on Arlene, and she soon fell asleep. I stayed by the bedside, but Les didn't leave. After a while, his assistant brought food and fruit. Eat something first. Les glanced at me and then left the room. He returned about half an hour later. Why aren't you eating? He pointed to the food on the table. I'm not hungry. Then just have some soup. Les removed his suit jacket. He sat down and slowly unpacked the takeout, serving the soup. I looked at the bowl of soup in front of me. It was my favorite fish maw chicken soup. I was a bit surprised. Even after 5 years, Les still remembered my preferences. After you finish the soup, we need to talk. Nina, I drank the soup anxiously. I couldn't really taste it. Arlene is my daughter, isn't she? Les got straight to the point. For a moment, I couldn't even come up with a lie. Even if I did, it would be useless. Les must have already figured everything out. Why did you get bullied after taking the money when you left? They wanted to take my parents' inheritance. Your parents' inheritance. Why would they think they're entitled to it? Because I'm a daughter, and Arlene is also a daughter. I couldn't help but sneer. In their eyes, our family is extinct, so the inheritance must go to their son. Les' face darkened. What's wrong with having a daughter? I think having a daughter is great. He looked at the sleeping little girl on the bed. The more he looked, the more he liked her. Auntie had just sent him a message, saying the little girl's eyebrows and forehead were just like his. Up close, it was indeed true, but she looked more like her mother, especially her big eyes and pointed chin. You like having a daughter? Les' question left me stunned. Memories that were almost faded suddenly became very clear. How Les had coldly pushed away our daughter time and again. How he had ruthlessly thrown her into the orphanage. Her cries seemed to still echo in my ears. My eyes burned, and tears rolled down my cheeks. Nina, why are you crying? You don't like her, Les. You don't like her at all. How do you know? My voice was hoarse but calm. Because to you, she's just a burden. Nina. Les' voice seemed tinged with anger. Leave, Les. We broke up 5 years ago. That's right. Les stood up slowly, looking down at me. If you were living a little better, not crying on the street with your daughter, being bullied, I wouldn't be meddling. I looked down and smiled. I can handle it myself. After all, this is a society governed by law. Les pointed at Arlene and her. Does she just have to be born without a father? I slowly lifted my head, tears blurring my vision. Les, let me tell you a story. By the end of the story, I was so choked up that I could barely speak. I don't know what happened to her later, because I had already died before she was sent to the orphanage. I looked at Arlene, who was sleeping soundly on the bed. She was my flesh and blood, the most important person I loved. I would never let her face such a tragic fate again. Nina, everything you're saying is impossible, but that's how it happened. If I hadn't left, if I had been entangled with you, Arlene and I would have ended up like this. Les frowned slightly, trying to reason with me patiently. All right, then let me ask you, after 5 years apart, did I get together with Maggie? That has nothing to do with me. Maybe you had some issues and were going through ups and downs. I was never with her. There's no question of ups and downs. But in the story, there is no but. Nina, I have no other woman. Les reached out and gently brushed the stray hairs from my cheek. Not before you, and not after you, but Maggie. Les looked at me calmly. After her divorce, she did hint at me once, but I rejected her. Why? I was skeptical. After all, there had been rumors swirling about the two of them. Everyone said Les had a crush on Maggie when he was younger. Why? Simply because I didn't like her. But didn't you have a crush on her before? Les was candid. It's normal to have feelings for someone beautiful when you're young. Maybe there were some hazy feelings back then, but soon I realized it wasn't romantic love. How did you know it wasn't romantic love? Because she's 2 years older than me, and quickly started dating someone. And when I found out, I didn't feel jealous at all. I was somewhat convinced. Anything else you want to ask? I shook my head. My mind was a tangled mess. I wanted to believe what Les was saying, but I was afraid. The plot of the story was beyond our control. In the end, it might still be the same outcome. So now I ask you. Les looked at me intently. The reason you suddenly wanted to break up back then was because of this, wasn't it? I didn't want to die or have Arlene end up in a welfare institution. Nina, why didn't you tell me? Told you. Told me what? How should I tell you? Did you go home during those days? Did you call me? You were always with Maggie. I couldn't even see you. At this point, I couldn't help but recall that social media post. Les' friends were waiting for him to tire of me and ditch me, but their attitude towards Maggie was entirely different. I still remember that line, age gap relationships are the best. And I still can't forget how terrible I felt at that time. After Maggie returned to the country, I only took her out for a meal once. After all, we've known each other since we were young. I always called her sister when we were kids. So why didn't you go home? Les' eyes showed a hint of a small, faint smile. Nina, I was like this even when I was busy before. I remember one time I didn't go home for half a month, and you didn't even call me once. Actually, he never liked phone calls or messages. When he was busy, he often went missing. I had gotten used to it, but the timing of that incident was too coincidental, so I couldn't help but believe he would watch me die for Maggie and abandon our daughter. Anyway, I don't believe what you said. My daughter and I have been doing well these years. I'll take care of these problems soon, and then there will be no other worries. I'll handle it for you. No, I've already filed a lawsuit and hired the best lawyer. I can handle it myself. I couldn't resist adding a bit of bitterness. With your money, you hired the top lawyer. After all, when Maggie divorced, Les had hired a top-notch lawyer at great expense. This lawyer won't do. Use my company's legal department. I said I don't need it. I can solve it myself. Nina, Les seemed somewhat helpless. I want to help you. Is that okay? If things are resolved quickly, Arlene can go to kindergarten peacefully. Right. During this time, my daughter was traumatized and refused to go to school no matter how I tried to coax her. Les' words made me waver. Moreover, Arlene is also my daughter. I have at least half the right to take care of her. I couldn't refute and only said after a moment, I have one condition. Go ahead. After everything is settled and you return to Beijing, we shouldn't meet again. If Arlene grows up and wants to see her biological father, I won't stop her. Of course, if you miss her, you can come to see her anytime. Nina, what do you mean? Just that. Les' lips tightened, his expression cold and solemn as he looked at me. Suit yourself. After a long pause, he said 2 words and turned to leave the hospital room. Once Les' legal department lawyer took over, things progressed rapidly and smoothly. The inheritance left by my parents was returned to me and my daughter. Among the troublesome relatives, the 2 who caused the most commotion ended up serving jail time. With this matter settled, the remaining relatives naturally settled down. After things calmed down, Les left for Beijing. Before he left, he took Arlene out for a whole day. When he met me, he ignored me. However, his aunt called me several times. Nina, how did you manage to control Les? I've never seen him so sulky before. It's as if we owe him billions. He either doesn't speak or makes me so mad when he does. Sweetheart, share some tips with Auntie so I can fight back. I stood by the window, looking downstairs. Les was bringing Arlene back. They played in the little garden downstairs for a while longer. I didn't know how he managed to make Arlene so happy. He had certainly become very good at entertaining her, not at all like when he was with me. Back then, he would just shower me with gifts or bully me in bed. Auntie, when will you return to Beijing? I'll see you off. Aren't you going back with Arlene? Arlene is used to it here. We're not going back for now. No wonder. I thought he was fuming because he couldn't get his wife and daughter to come back. But Nina, From Auntie's observation, Les could still be salvaged. Do you want to give him another chance? The doorbell rang. I snapped back to reality and went to open the door. Les was standing outside with Arlene. The little girl was sweating from playing, and clung to him without letting go. She chattered excitedly when she saw me. Mommy, Mommy, we went to 3 amusement parks today. Uncle even lifted me high. So high, higher than a giraffe. Really, that's very high. I reached out to take Arlene. You're all sweaty. How about we go take a bath first? The little girl looked reluctantly at Les but obediently settled into my arms. Would you like to come in for a cup of tea? I pursed my lips and looked at Les. It was very hot, and he was sweating. No, I'm heading to the airport soon. Les' voice was cold. I felt the little one in my arms stiffen suddenly. Looking down, Arlene's eyes were already red. My heart ached terribly. Fatherly love and maternal love cannot be replaced. Perhaps, with time, Les and Arlene's relationship would deepen. That outcome might change as a result, but the future is unknown. Without Maggie, could another female lead appear? In a novel, characters' fates are controlled by the author's pen. I couldn't afford to take that risk. All right, be safe on the way. I hugged my daughter tightly and smiled at Les. I'll take her to bathe first, so I won't see you off. At the moment the door was about to close, Les suddenly reached out and blocked the gap. Nina. His voice was still as indifferent as ever. His gaze had no emotion. After returning to Beijing, I will transfer half of my assets to Arlene. She is my daughter. I will never neglect or abandon her. As for you, he looked at me intently, paused for a few seconds. Then he suddenly laughed lightly. Forget it. He wasn't going to force a woman. Moreover, to Nina, he was not important. He had left without a second thought back then. Even less important than Arlene. It was only now that he fully realized how ungrateful she was. Les turned and walked towards the elevator. I held Arlene in the doorway. I turned and saw the photos of my parents on the entrance table. My emotions suddenly broke down. When my dad was sick, I saw a story online. An elderly man, worried about his daughter living alone, had put his prepared portrait in the entrance. It could scare away bad people. Dad had joked with me about doing the same. Even if I'm dead, I want to protect our 2 little cribbabies once more. In the photo, my parents looked at me lovingly, smiling. At this moment, I missed them immensely. Apart from them, no one else would love and tolerate me unconditionally. My daughter in my arms had tears falling silently, not making a sound. I held her tightly, tears streaming down my face. Mommy. Arlene sniffled and gently tugged at my sleeve. My face was a mess from crying. I followed her pointing finger. In my blurred vision, a tall figure appeared. Les had somehow come back. I didn't know how long he had been standing there watching me cry. The grievances and sadness in my heart surged like a rising spring tide, overflowing and consuming me. I looked up at him, reaching out to embrace him. Les slowly walked up to me. He didn't say anything, just held both me and our daughter tightly. After a long time, when my emotions gradually settled, he finally wiped the tears from my face. Nina, even if you don't call me husband, I will still pamper you. And Arlene, of course. And Arlene. Les looked at me, then at our daughter, and suddenly smiled. 2 little cribbabies. The trip back to Beijing was postponed. Les' aunt came to pick up Arlene. She was unmarried and childless but loved Arlene dearly. Nina, don't spoil him too much. Scold him if needed, and put him in his place, his aunt gently advised me, then scolded Les. Consider yourself warned. Take it easy. Nina is delicate and can't handle your 5-year-long single dog antics. I was so embarrassed I couldn't lift my head. Les, however, was completely unfazed. Seems like that 40-year-old single Bertram Joe is quite a handful. His aunt's face turned bright red. She bit her teeth and hit Les. You little rascal. Are you disrespectful and lawless? Les let her hit him a few times, then laughed. All right, let's go quickly. Bertram Joe's been waiting for a long time. As soon as his aunt left with Arlene, Les took off his coat and picked me up. Les, what are you doing? Want to see the masterpiece of Nuwa closely? He pressed me onto the bed, pinning my wrists above my head. Before I could speak or resist, he kissed me. His aunt was absolutely right. A man who has been single for 5 years is indeed terrifying when he starts to stir. Les, be gentle. Can't be gentle? His kisses trailed down, eventually landing on the moonlit sand dunes. Nina, in the deep night, his voice was tinged with a husky passion. Nuwa did a great job. My body tensed, like a bowstring pulled tight. Then his fingertips played with me. I really like it. Les, you're shameless. Call me what? Les. The waves of passion hit harder and harder. My moans became fragmented. Husband, husband. Nina, Les, kiss me deeply once more. Say you love me. Nina, it should be you saying it. He kissed away the tears from the corners of my eyes. I love you. I let out a soft moan but still reached up to wrap my arms around his neck. Les, I love you too. 10 years after our marriage, the things that once pierced my heart never happened. Les was a model husband and an exceptional father. In the 2nd year of our marriage, Maggie also got married. She was doing well in her marriage, and occasionally, when she returned to the country, our families had dinner together. By then, our daughter was about to enter high school. One night, when Les was away on a business trip, our daughter came to sleep with me. We whispered to each other until we finally fell asleep. When we woke up in the morning, our daughter suddenly hugged me, crying, "Mommy, I dreamed of Grandpa and Grandma." I was surprised. I dreamt of them too. Grandpa said, "My little cribbaby has grown up." Our daughter sobbed. Grandpa also said that he and Grandma will bless us from heaven to always be safe and happy. They will. Our family will be safe and happy. I didn't tell my daughter that Dad had said a lot more to me. Nina, go and enjoy your life boldly. The things you're worried about will never happen. Why? In the dream, my parents smiled lovingly, because every time you brought Les to see us, he always made serious promises to us. Promises to love you well, cherish you, and take care of you for life. In these 10 years, hasn't he done enough? I cried like a baby in the dream. How can someone in their 30s still cry like a child? It seems Les has taken good care of our little cribbaby. Thinking of these words, I couldn't help but cry and laugh. I picked up the phone and called Les. Nina. His voice was gentle and low, with a faint smile in his tone when he said my name. Husband, I miss you. Can you come back early? His voice was incredibly soft. Honey, I'm already at the airport. I'll be home tonight. The story ends here. Feel free to subscribe to the channel for the latest content and updates on new novels every day.